Well, welcome everyone. So this talk is about securing Ratpack. So the assumption is that you know a little bit about Ratpack at this point. Before this talk, I'm going to not really describe what's going on inside of Ratpack. So if you don't feel like that's going to be super useful, feel free to go. And anywhere along the lines, though, feel free to ask questions. I'm happy to. We have a pretty small group, so we're happy to kind of go over whatever. Hopefully we get some fun. The slides are available online, and we're going to be doing a little bit of coding together. I'll do it up here. You guys can help me with all my typos. But the links to all of that is within the slides themselves. So you can get to the GitHub and find everything. So kind of a quick agenda of what we're going to do. Describe who I am a little bit more. I'm going to show you what a simple handler example is, and kind of talk about when it works, when it doesn't work. We'll talk about forcing SSL. In particular, I'll talk about AWS because it's probably one of the easiest ways to do it. That's the way I've done it a lot. So we're going to go over Ratpack sessions and how to actually do sessions because it's pretty easy once you get in there, but it's not that documented yet, and that's something I need to work on. We'll talk about Pack4j. And then we'll do basic and Twitter auth, just kind of show all of that works. And then to finalize, we'll do a little case study with Seller HQ, their Ratpack application. We'll talk a little bit more about them. So I'm Jeff Beck, if you haven't heard. I'm BeckJ01 on Twitter. I was on the first slide, and that's if you ever want to question anything, feel free to bother me there. I'm pretty good about responding. I'm an engineer at a company called SmartThings. We are an Internet of Things company. We do a lot of, right now we do a lot of Grails and Groovy, and we're looking at some very exciting stuff with things like Ratpack and Vertex and things to come. So it's been a lot of fun working there. We get to do scale that I haven't done anywhere else before. So we have this idea of a simple handler. This is going to be the absolute starting block. If you're using the Groovy DSL in Ratpack, you can the handler's block. The first handler you put in here, if you don't specify path or anything, everything's going to flow through there, no matter what. So what we can do then is we can just implement a really simple auth system this way. It's not super complicated, it's not super robust, but hey, it should work. We have authorizations, we can do responses, not a big problem. You'll notice that we can send, we do response.status to send 401s. We can send pretty much anything we want at that point, and that's pretty easy. We have to do response.send though, because what will happen is if we never if we just set the status and we don't do next to go to the next handler, we're just going to hang there. And then it's going to time out and not really do anything useful. And that's not what we want. We want to send that response right away back to and kind of exit the handler chain at that point. When we see the next, all right, is everyone familiar with what that does in Ratpack? Yes? No? I'm going to go kind of. Okay. Basically, it's gonna say go ahead and continue processing, go to whatever the next handler in the chain is. So this is not going to work if you want to do anything with identities, because all we need is check authorization. Authentication. If you want to do authorization or roles, none of that's going to be built in, and you probably don't want to build all that by hand. If you want to mix secure and insecure content, we didn't even think about that. We were just securing everything. And if you want to have multiple ways to authenticate besides just a simple auth token, we're not supporting that either right now. But it does actually work for a few things. Stateless microservices, I've actually used that really simple handler for, and then we had a backing that we actually, from like public config, we would feed in all the auth tokens of the known services and have a really simple lookup. And that was a really nice way to do lightweight security, just to make sure, it was just making sure like the things that we defined interacted with the services that we defined. So as far as overhead goes, it was really, really light. So that's why we wanted it. I actually use it quite a bit in prototyping as well. And what I'll do is, instead of digging into like whether or not they have the right token, I'll actually just check that they sent an auth token. Like, oh, you have the authorization header, the authentication header, great. That's what I want to make sure you had. And I'll stub out kind of the rest of the calls, just as a way to make sure the client's doing the handshake the way I expect. But I'll use that as like a service double almost in early stages of development. And that's something that works really well with the security in Ratpack is do it really lightweight like this. You can just make sure that they're actually sending something in the correct format. And then when you build out your full-fledged application with some other models, we'll dig into that. So why don't I show you, let's see. All right, so that's the same code you saw before. And we'll just run it quick. You'll notice it's very easy to start up, and I'm going to use a little REST client to interact with it. So we get our simple hello world. And just to make sure it's not a bad token, you'll notice we get a 401 with no response body. And that's usually the way I do my 401s. Before I forget, I'll switch that back. Alright. So one of the next things we want to do is we want to start thinking about forcing SSL. And that's something I think is very important to do because most of the time when you're running these applications, you're not going to, I personally don't terminate SSL with Ratpack. I do it with like AWS, Elastic Load Balancer or something like that. So in general, if you're setting up something called the public address in Ratpack to have the HTTPS in it, all you're going to have to do is send a redirect, a 301 back to the raw URI, and Ratpack will take care of making sure you've got the correct host name and HTTPS and everything, as long as you set up your public address. But to actually do this in AWS, the way we actually check to whether or not the call to you is SSL or not is we're going to check the, it's not very big. We're going to check, no, that's not going to work. All right. We're going to check something called the X forwarded protocol. So these headers are all put on by the EOB in AWS. And as long as you're checking that it's HTTPS, then you're able to tell whether or not the request came in. And so the normal setup in, let's see if this will work. Wow, it does not want to zoom correctly today. So you're actually going to push, in your AWS config, you're going to push both 443 and 80 back to whatever port you're running Ratpack on. I happen to be running it on the default 150/50 still. So what will happen is anything that hits with port 80 will hit your first handler. You'll see that it's not SSL because it doesn't have the right forwarded protocol. And then it will redirect you with 301 back over 443, and then you're secure. And it's a lot easier than, I don't know if you guys have set up, right now we have to run an Apache or an Nginx in front of something to do our redirects for us because we're doing some complex things. This is a really easy, lightweight way to get into that. Let's say we want to do something a little more complicated than just simple gatekeeping. Ratpack provides a session module that will do a lot of what we want to, if we want to pass some data around for a session. All that's built in for us. As long as if you've seen the syntax, we just do the compile dependency of session. to actually bind it in our bindings block, we want to do this, and you'll notice that we have to create a new map sessions module. So right now, sessions are kept in memory, and it's just a map, and we have to kind of specify how many and what the TTL is for the sessions, and that's what we're doing there. And now, once that's all built in, we can start interacting with the session. Pretty easy ways to get the session, terminate it, get the context, get it from the context. If we want to actually interact with session data, we can see that we can put things on the session and then in a different handler get it back off. So to actually show you that, we will check out the Is that readable for you guys? Okay. So you notice in our bindings, we set up the session module like we said, and in our same like simple handler where we're rejecting people, and now we're going to also go ahead and put on the session, we're going to put add a key of example, just Galaxy. And then in our handler itself, we can get the session store back out of the context request and go ahead and try to get the example out of the session if it's there. And so, if we jump, started up. And then originally we were getting hello world. If we request now, we get hello galaxy because it's pulled it off the session in a downstream handler. Now I'm showing the really simple example, but you can do a lot more with that, such as add users or other context to your session, and then pull them back out down the line. Since most of the time you're kind of not calling into handlers directly, it's moving down a chain. This is a really great way to get data back out. So, yeah. Right now though, the session API is very limited. You'll notice that anything you interact with on the session is a synchronous call. And that's not going to work if you do anything outside of in-memory on-the-box sessions. So what we're going to do is we're going to be changing the session storage interface in the future. We hope to make it look something like this. It will probably may change in the future a little bit more. This isn't even in the code yet. But the idea is to move everything towards being promises that you get back. So instead of waiting synchronously when you get things in and out of the session store, it'll all become asynchronous. So the reason we want to do that is so that we can support things like Memcache or Redis, or if you want to use a database, all of that's coming. So right now, if you want to use sessions, you're going to be limited to sessions for a particular instance. So you have to use sticky sessions right now. So you can't, you're not going to share session state across all your different instances yet. And that's coming. Is there any questions so far about the sessions? Pretty straightforward, hopefully. The things that the big change coming is, like I said, just the promises. Yeah.
Do you know exactly, do you have a timeline or?
I was thinking about doing it on the plane back. So I'm hoping in the next month or two it'll actually be production ready, but we'll see. It'll definitely be before we go 1.0. This will get changed because we know you can't use the in-memory ones for 1.0, so that'll get updated before 1.0. I don't know that there's no one. I don't think anyone else is super interested in it, so I'm the slowest on the team probably. Russ is really fast. So if you convince him, he'll get it. Has anyone ever heard of Pack4j?
Yes.
Yes, yes. Okay, Pack4j, I had actually not heard of it until I saw it in Ratpack, and I was really excited about it. It's this nice framework to work across many things, but the thing that I found really exciting is, I pulled it up. Here's everything supported out of the box for Pack4j, and the key ones for me was SAML. and OAuth is great, but there's lots of OAuth clients, but SAML. Because I don't know if anyone's worked with SAML directly before, but it's incredibly painful.
Painful as a euphemism.
Yeah, yeah. In general, if you can avoid it, do. Yeah. So Pack4j out of the box is going to give us a lot of great interactions for OAuth and the basic inform. So I'm going to show a little bit of these examples with it and just kind of show you how easy it is with what's already built in. The biggest thing is there's a module for Pack4j in Ratpack, and really what it's done is it's added a few abstract classes and a few things that tie into the handler chain, and it does some handler decoration inside of Ratpack to make sure you can secure everything very easily without having to add a lot of handlers to your system. So you don't have to do a lot of work, you just kind of have to set up the correct looks. The other big thing that was added that's custom to Ratpack is this Ratpack Authorizer. So this is what is kind of, I don't know a good analogy to, it holds basically whether or not you should authenticate for authentication is required for any request, and whether or not you have to get authorization. So this is kind of the entry point that gets called by Pack4j, the module, to make sure whether or not it needs to secure things. The best is the abstract authorizer is very simple, so most of the time, if you are just doing authentication and not authorization, you can extend that very easily and just figure out what URLs you want to secure. Or you could be a lot more complicated, since it's just giving you the request. You can be as clever as you'd like. Don't be clever at security, use a whitelist. So, once again, we're going to pull in a module, and that's that Ratpack dependency again. But what's special about Pack4j is a lot of the libraries are not provided as part of the core module, such as this is the HTTP. It's really hard to read on this color. So this is just the pack. That made it a little better?
Yeah.
Okay. The HTTP jar will contain things for basic and formal, and that's provided by Pack4j. And just by using that or the OAuth, you can add that support, and then it just works alongside the Pack4j modules. So in order to wire in what we're supporting, we have this module we add, which is the Pack4j module. And if you're doing a single authentication source, that you will be able to use this really easily. So we're going to go through most of the examples with this, and then I'll tell you about what SellerHQ did to get around. There are other ways to get around it, but theirs is probably the most interesting use case. So you'll notice that we're adding in a basic auth client and something called my dumb username password authenticator and a secure all authorizer. So the two things we're passing in is the client and the authorizer is what we pass to the Pack4j module. You'll notice for this client, the basic auth client takes a username and password authenticator. So depending on which client you pass in, there'll be different requirements to what you give, but it's pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and check out. Where is basic auth? It's so big back here. You'll notice when we first do this, because we just changed it, we don't have that button in. Basic auth's not being, so what you'll have to do sometimes is just hit the refresh on the Gradle, and that will refresh in the background. I find if I'm doing a lot of things, there it goes. If I'm doing a lot of things bouncing around between different modules and packages, it's just not going to show up right away. So in order to do the username and password authenticator actually only has one method we have to deal with, and that's just validate. It's going to give us the credentials object that comes from Pack4j, and this is what kind of I find very nice, because even if you put Pack4j in front of Spring Security or other things, we have a very unified interface to deal with these things, and it's a lot easier to program against Pack4j and then change things later. But so we're just going to check whether or not the username is Jeff, and whether or not they have the word password, because password is the only valid password in my world. Just like Spring Security, we use exceptions to break out of the flow. So the validate is a void method. So if at any point you want to fail the authentication, you have to actually throw an exception, which is, it's okay. In this case, they had such a clean API. I personally would have liked to be able to return, but that's just me being used to returning things, like returning a failure. But let's see if it works. So now that we don't have token, we'll get the simple hello world. Now, best part is, since it's basic auth, I have to go to here to fail. And you'll notice that you get absolutely nothing back, and it just asks you to authenticate. So even though in the code, we're actually setting these we're setting these messages. Only Jeff's allowed, and only password is password, things like that. We don't see them at all. And the reason for that is when these get thrown, the only thing that's happening is in our logs, that's where the messages end up, unfortunately. So there's no secure message coming back. And since the other thing that we're using is this secure all and authorizer. So all we're doing is saying, no matter what, everything is required to be secure. So the problem with that is we don't have a place to direct the user to give them an error message. So if you secure everything blanket, there's no way to give them a nice page to give them an error message. Now, since I'm running in development mode, I do get an error page that has a few things, which basically just says I'm unauthorized. But you won't get this kind of this error page in production mode. Any questions so far? So this is the authorizer, and there's two methods in the abstract authorizer. We only have to override is authentication required, and if you want to just be really draconian, you can just do return true. Now let's go to something a little more complicated. Most people don't want to have to use basic auth to sign into your web page. Well, no one should ever want to. But we also have the Twitter auth. So let's say we want to allow users to just sign in with Twitter. It's pretty simple. We're going to import OAuth instead of HTTP. And then we just have a little more setup to do because instead of password authorizer, we need a Twitter client key and secret. And then I'm going to stick with the secure all authorizer for now, just because it's a little simpler if we just secure everything for now through these examples. So to do this, we need to create a Twitter app. So in any of these OAuth flows, you need a client secret and a client key. Both of those come from the thing you're going to authenticate against. So in Twitter's case, we can create a new app. So why don't we go ahead and create a brand new app, and I can kind of talk through what these details are. So the website is something, with Twitter, you're going to have a real website URL. And it doesn't have, it has to look like a real URL. It doesn't have to be live. So I actually use like localhost.com. This has to be valid just because it's required, but it's not going to actually affect the OAuth flow. The callback URL isn't required at this time, and we have a really long developer agreement that we agree to.
We will read, of course.
Just photo.
Really, my description is too short.
It's like passwords. You need at least numbers and special characters in the description.
You can tell I don't do a lot of live coding, so that because of these reasons. Cool demo that is at Greach 2015. That should be long. Yeah. So now we have this kind of giant settings area. You usually don't have to care about these things unless you're setting up custom. What you do have to care about is the keys and access tokens. I'm going to delete this account right after this, so don't get any wild ideas. So, as for the Twitter changes, the main thing we've done is we removed the dumb password, user password checker, because we got rid of the HTTP class jar completely, and all of the classes that it implemented are no longer there. So we now have a key and a secret that we have to pass into our Twitter client. And your key, and then your secret. And I honestly get these mixed up a lot, and by convention, most places do shorter one on the left, longer one on the right, and I tend to mix up the names, but so we should now be able to go through an OAuth flow with Twitter for our app. Oh. So here, that's. Wait, am I connected to the end? Still? Yes. That's.
It's reverse.com.
Yeah, that it shouldn't need to do that. What we can do is specify. See if we specify the callback. That fits. Yeah, Twitter does not like. So Twitter doesn't like localhost in callback URL.
I think you can use the IP address, like.
Yeah. Let's see. There we go. So you have to have something in callback URL for it to work, but it doesn't have to be the thing you're actually going to. I don't know why. That's a Twitter thing. That's so what was happening. The reason we got that infinite circular redirect is since we're doing the authorize all, no matter where you fail to, it's going to hit that and try to relog you in. So what was happening is Twitter said, "Oh, I can't authorize you because you don't have a callback URL set," and probably had a decent error message, but we threw it away and tried to log in again constantly. So we can now sign in, and now we get hello Twitter. Yay! All right. You'll also notice in the logs we had quite a bit of exceptions, and you'll notice there's a lot. Oh yeah, there we go. OAuth callback URL. So basically, they did give us an error message, and I was in the logs, and I didn't read it. We see more slides. Did I lose the slides? There we go. We can jump. There's some examples for GitHub, but we can jump back to that because I kind of want to keep going to show you that. Yeah, so what I want to show you now is inside the Twitter client itself, we have a pretty limited, that's impossible to read. I'm going to do this way. So we have, this is the entire Twitter client for Pack4j. It's pretty lightweight, you'll notice. And the reason for that is there's an abstract OAuth client that's either 1.0 or 2.0 that you can use. Now, if you extend that OAuth client, you're able to pretty much just set up some URLs and some scopes, which isn't something Twitter needs, so that you go no scope for Twitter. If you need to do a custom integration that's not built into Pack4j, the base OAuth clients that they have built in are very easy to extend and modify for your use case. So Pack4j is a really great library to start with. All right. Is everyone pretty familiar with OAuth scopes? Or should, okay, fine. Well, let's go ahead and show you. So this is the link to the OAuth scopes for GitHub because I feel like they have a really fine-grained scope control. So when you're requesting OAuth, your client, your side that's authenticating against someone else, can provide scopes to say what things you want to be able to do via that API. So if you're using it just to say, I want to know this user's email, and so they can log in, then that's just the user scope. Or you can do even just user email scope in GitHub. And most of the time, people will have a very default scope to say, yeah, go ahead and use their account with me to log in. But if you want to interact with their APIs, you have to get granted the right scope authorities so that you can go and make API requests on their behalf. So with this kind of initial client, you can get all the keys, you can do your scopes so that you can then make API requests later. So that's not going to be built into the OAuth like Pack4j part of it, but you should be able to reuse a lot of that to do a lot more complex integrations. And in general, you always want to go with the least amount of scope you need, because that keeps it, so if you do have a breach, you don't destroy people's things, because I worry more about what I'm going to do to other people when I mess up, because security is a constant battle, and you're always, I feel like I'm always on the losing end, so. So, Cellar HQ. It's an online list of your beer cellar. It's cellarhq.com, you should check it out. They were nice enough to let me poke around their code for months to really dig in. So this is for the big beer geeks that like cellar the beer for years and then try later. But why do we care? Because it's all written in Ratpack, and the rumor is they're going to open source everything, and it's a rather complex Ratpack app, so that would be pretty exciting if they do get it open source. They have dual Twitter and web form authentication, and they do it in such a way that they end up coalescing the users, they can log in either way, and they end up being the same user. So that's a little special case that's not something like built into the Ratpack modules for packaging, but what they've done is extended everything in such a way. Because one of the nice things with these modules and everything being pretty much simple classes, it's very easy to extend and move on different points. They use a complex authorizer that we haven't really seen yet, and they use handler decoration, which is a little more advanced, but if you're doing modules, it's a really great way to go. And they also have roles as well. So in order to do this dual authentication, instead of using the modules that we were seeing, the Pack4J modules, they provide their own module. So they will just, basically, they made something called the authentication module, and they supply that. Now their authorizer, which I quite like, is based on a whitelist for anonymous access. So they have every request that comes through, it looks so good on this screen. Every request that comes through runs through this little check, and what they do is they end up using these a couple simple methods to transform that list of regex into actual regex patterns over here. And you'll notice that they're very dry people, so they didn't want to put the caret to start everything in every regex, so that they force everything through to make it an exact pattern match, which I think is kind of funny because I'm not that dry at times. It's pretty simple. Is authentication required is the authorizer that we saw before that I was just returning true to. And all they're doing is doing a regex match across that big list. Order does matter for their list. So what they do is they put the most likely things to authorize at the top, since they do it in order. So you want to short circuit as fast as possible. Now, since this is just your own class that you're writing, you can get as complex as you want, and you can make things, maybe you can do a bloom filter or something. If you have a really high traffic and you need to check quickly, you could do a bloom filter and then check whether or not you need to authorize and things like that. That seems like a little bit of overkill, but depending on what you're doing, it might be necessary. So authorization is something we haven't seen before, and I was ignoring it. They're checking whether or not a user has an admin role. To give them access to literally something that just says /admin. I didn't show that part, but that's the matches any path. An admin role required it does the same regex matching, but it's just /admin. Now what's really interesting is this user profile will have roles built into it. So that comes from Pack4J, and you're able to check roles very easily. And you're able to, they use roles that are enum, so they're a little easier to deal with throughout their code base. And I found that is a pretty nice way instead of having strings everywhere, which I probably should have done elsewhere. The handler decorator basically provides you a way to add handlers onto existing ones. So you'll notice when we were doing Twitter and the Twitter OAuth or the basic auth, all that happened was I added the module, and then suddenly I got redirected somewhere to log me in. Now that happens by a handler decorator going in and applying new handlers, basically the login handlers, in front of the existing handler that was already there. And they're using the same thing in their custom module. They also do tie-ins for users, so once they know who the user is, they actually want to redirect them somewhere special. So what they do is there's an auth success callback, so that you can tie into, and then they set some session variables that their handlers down in the chain read the session variable and say, oh well, I know what seller I'm going to, and that's how they redirect the user to the seller. Any questions? All right. Thank you. That's 40 minutes ready. I think, unless my timer's wrong. If we have time, I can go back and show you the GitHub, actual GitHub integration, because they have a lot cooler setup for Twitter. Does anyone have our end time?
56 right now. 56. 4 minutes.
4 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, back to you. Dave. What do I do? There we go. So we have there's in GitHub, you can go in and create register a new application. It's in your settings for applications. And you'll notice also this is where all of your other apps that you are authorized against are, and you revoke tokens. I noticed that I needed to go revoke them. This, once again, has the same URL problem. The callback URL in this case is actually always required, and it doesn't complain. It actually has to be the correct one. This one's called client ID. It's the same as key. Like I said, left or right for size. So the main difference is just adding a GitHub client. We also are getting a GitHub profile back, which is a little more rich than just a normal Twitter profile. And so I'm actually going to show my username, the followers that I have, and my disk usage. I have no idea what unit that's in though. Yeah?
When you specify the scope that you request?
So in the GitHub client itself, it's going to have a default scope built in, and it looks, from what I can tell, if you wanted to actually change the scope that's provided by default by the GitHub client, you would need to extend the GitHub client and just set the scope to something else, and then instantiate your own and pass it in. By default, we get the user scope, which has access to all that user metadata. That should just run. So this is a much better screen than Twitter gives, and it actually will review you can review all the permissions. So this is driven by your scopes, and depending on what scopes you pass in, you get very different results. And you can see I have access to stuff. Yeah, so the organizations themselves determine what you have access to, and apparently every organization allows user access. And there we go. So now that's my screen name on GitHub, my followers, and whatever disk usage percentage that is. I don't know what unit that is. I couldn't find it in the docs. I didn't look carefully though. Thank you.